We begin today's show looking at this week's historic bomb cyclone blizzard that blanketed states with snow. From Maryland to Massachusetts and Providence, Rhode Island, more than 37 inches of snow fell, setting a new record for the city. Climate scientists have long warned that climate change will cause more intense and more destructive nor'easters. We're joined in Philadelphia by Michael Mann, Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania, Director of Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media. His most recent book, Science Under Siege, which he co-wrote with Dr. Peter Hotez. Last year, Professor Mann co-wrote a study titled The Intensification of the Strongest Nor'easters. It was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I'm speaking to you from New York City, Professor Mann. Juan just left on one of the last planes before the bomb cyclone from New York, where our huge event was canceled for our 30th anniversary, and went back to Chicago because here in New York, a state of emergency was declared in the city and in the state by both the mayor and the governor. They were talking about a life-threatening situation. No one was allowed to be on the streets yesterday until noon. Can you talk about what's happening, how this relates to climate change?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. It's good to be with you. And here in Philly, we saw a fair amount of that snow as well. We got more than a foot. This was a historic bomb cyclone, as we sometimes call them, a nor'easter, which has to do with the fact that these storms are so strong that in one sector of the storm, you actually get winds coming from the east, which is rare for a mid-latitude storm. Now, these storms, unlike most mid-latitude storms, these coastal storms, these nor'easters, feed on the heat of the oceans. Now, we don't think of the oceans as being that warm in the winter, but they're much warmer than the land, and they still contain a substantial amount of heat. And like a hurricane, these storms feed on that heat. That's what leads to their intensification, why they become so strong. This storm was so strong, it actually had an eye-like feature. Now, it's not quite the same as the eye you see in a hurricane, but it's often a measure of just how intense this storm was. It was as strong as measured by the central pressure of the storm, one of the metrics we use, nearly as strong as a Cat 3 hurricane. And so, like hurricanes, they feed on the heat of the oceans. That gives them their intensity, and it provides all of that moisture that's available to dump out in record snowfalls.
So, Professor, does this indicate that we're going to be facing many more of these nor'easters in the future than we have in the past?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. Whether we'll see more of these storms or fewer of them is a little uncertain because there are a whole bunch of factors that come into that. But what we do know with some degree of confidence is that the strongest storms are getting stronger. We're seeing more intense nor'easters, and we are seeing larger snowfalls. And that's really what does the most harm, the most damage, what poses the greatest risk, are the strongest storms with the strongest damaging winds that produce the largest amount of snowfall. And we're seeing in the observations an increase in those intensities and an increase in those snowfall totals. And we expect to see that increase as long as we continue to warm up the planet by burning fossil fuels and putting carbon pollution into the atmosphere.
And what about the country's ability to respond to these storms? What policies of the Trump administration are making that more difficult in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, we saw this, we've been seeing this with the recent hurricane strikes, the devastating flooding that we saw in the southeastern U.S. During the hurricane season a couple of years ago, more than a year ago or so. What we're seeing, is that the dismantling of, for example, FEMA, the lack of resources that they have is preventing, the sorts of assistance that typically would be provided to those in harm's way. And moreover, the Trump administration is dismantling our atmospheric modeling capability. Their attack on the National Center for Atmospheric Research, defunding this historic institution, NCAR, as it's called, does a lot of the extreme weather modeling that's used by NOAA, for example, to predict extreme weather events and to advise risk assessments of those events. And so in a whole number of ways, the defunding of the science, the defunding of the infrastructure for assistance, the Trump administration is truly putting Americans in harm's way.
Earlier this month, Professor Mann, a coalition of public health and environmental groups filed a lawsuit in federal court seeking to block President Trump's rollback of the 2009 endangerment finding, which enabled the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. In a separate petition, 18 children and young adults also sued the EPA, arguing the burning of fossil fuels is denying them their constitutional rights to life and liberty. Can you talk about these extreme measures of the EPA and what that endangerment finding means now?
Yeah, thanks, because that's actually the single greatest assault that we've seen from the administration on climate action is the effort to, well, now that they've at least temporarily overturned the endangerment finding, which was a finding by the Supreme Court. They've been blaming this on the Obama administration. No, it was the Supreme Court that found that indeed the EPA was required to regulate carbon dioxide pollution from fossil fuel burning. And it was then 2 years later, it was actually codified by the EPA. It is the primary means by which the United States has been able to meet its obligations to the rest of the world when it comes to limiting carbon emissions. The endangerment finding is basically the policy vehicle that allows for the regulation of carbon dioxide emissions from coal-fired power plants. It's the primary vehicle that allows the government to regulate fuel efficiency standards. And it was because of that endangerment finding that the Obama administration was able to, to keep its promises to the rest of the world. And that was critical for reaching global agreements like the Paris Agreement. And of course, we know that Trump has even pulled out of the Paris Agreement now. So the Trump administration is doing the bidding of the fossil fuel industry. That was basically spelled out in Project 2025. They said this was what they were going to do, and this is what they are doing.
Michael Mann, I want to thank you for being with us, Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Thanks for watching Democracy Now! On YouTube. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to make sure you never miss a video. And for more of our audience-supported journalism, go to democracynow.org, where you can download our news app, sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the daily podcast, and so much more.